thank you very much for inviting me to join in. I will address the international context. I called my presentation Women for Water on Rio Dublin Principle 3 for Integrated Water Resources Management. I have looked at the recent assessment of research in the women and water sphere, and then it shows that when in this topic, the emphasis is on women as water users. There's not so much interest yet in women as water managers. So this is what I would like to address in this presentation, especially in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. In my opinion, the SDG 5 on gender equality and women's empowerment and the SDG 6 on water security, they are two underlying foundational SDGs for achieving the agenda and all the other SDGs. And especially this interface is very interesting. But before going into that, I'm a person, I like to do definitions because people usually use phrases and interpret them in a totally different way. So to start off on this topic, I would really like to make a distinction between gender-sensitive water management and women-inclusive water management. Now, if we talk gender-sensitive, we all know that women and men have a different physique and very often also different roles in society, including their reproductive roles. And as a consequence, the way the water is allocated and health hazards are perceived and addressed, and how climate change and water-related disasters affect people, women and men, may be quite different according to their roles. And gender-sensitive water management takes those gender-specific differences into account. On the other hand, women inclusiveness is about women having an equal voice in decision-making about water issues that concern them. And this is different. So sometimes if you involve the women, you automatically involve the gender aspect, but that is not always the case. Let me give you one small example from the recent World Water Forum 8. The German Kazakh University, amongst others, has done a great job in preparing the inputs from the region for the World Water Forum 8. And I had the pleasure of being in this pre-conference in Dushanbe. And if you look at the gender balance in that conference, there was quite gender parity, about equal amounts of men and women, I would say. But there was a strong presence of the academia and of water professionals, and only 5 to 6 representative of women civil society. Now, when it came to voting on the priorities for the World Water Forum, none of the gender issues made it into a priority. And when those 6 women representing civil society said, well, this is not a fair ruling, then one gentleman stood up and he said, look around you. There's an equal amount of men and women in the audience. So you are just outnumbered and outvoted. This is a typical example of not being gender sensitive, because the female academia, they voted for data for their technical subjects. And it did not occur to them that gender was important, because that is not the peer group they belong to in that conference. So I hope I make a little bit clear why you have to look at gender sensitivity and at women inclusiveness as two separate things, and that a woman may or may not be gender sensitive in her professional life. Now, going back to the water goal, the target that we are talking about is 6.5. I've made it in blue because this is the integrated water resources management, which should be implemented at all levels by the year 2030. And this is underlying all the other targets. On the other hand, on the SDG 5, we have target 5.5 to ensure women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision-making in political, economic, and public life. If you combine these two targets, in fact, then you have the Rio Dublin Principle 3 for Integrated Water Resources Management, which was agreed already in 1992 at the World Summit in Rio de Janeiro, the UNCED. And the heading is Women Play a Central Role in the Provision, Management, and Safeguarding of Water. And we will go into more detail about that later. Definitions for me are very important because very often if people use a phrase, they might have a totally different interpretation. Integrated water resources management was defined by the Global Water Partnership also early on after 1992 as the process which promotes the coordinated development and management of water, land and related resources in order to maximize the resultant economic and social welfare in an equitable manner without compromising the sustainability of vital ecosystems. So there you have the integrated approach and the holistic approach. The word management is misleading because IWRM is not a management concept. It is a holistic concept for water governance. It describes the what, the interdisciplinary approach, cutting across levels, sectors, and strata in society, and giving due consideration to the environment. It does not specify the how, the governance system that is best suited to achieve IWRM in a given socioeconomic, political, and environmental context. This with the notion that the Dublin principles for IWRM prescribe stakeholder participation as an essential element of the how. So there is some prescription there. And there something goes wrong. We have to go the other way. As I told you before, the IWRM is guided by 4 principles. And the 4 of them you see here on the screen. As you get all the information, I will not go into that because of time. I want to say, however, that this IWRM has been practiced by many countries for a long time now, because it started in 1992, the concept. And Lubel and Edelbach State, they did a good assessment of, I think 13 or 20 even countries across the globe where IWRM is practiced for a long time. And they came to the conclusion that this integration is 3 different types of integration. They call it functional integration. And functional integration basically is about the different ways that water is used in the course from the source to the sea. And so the functions that it has in an ecosystem for agriculture, for transport, all these sorts of things, and that very often overlap and have conflicting demands. That's the functional bit. The institutional integration is more about the way the water is managed and how those different institutions, mostly government institutions in most countries, who have a mandate or a jurisdiction for water management, how they coordinate their efforts, talk to each other, communicate, and come into sort of practice a holistic approach, which is more and more important now that water is becoming scarcer. And the 3rd type of integration they talk about is the societal integration, in which falls, of course, the involvement of women and other stakeholders. And this refers to, if we refer this back to the Dublin principles that I talked to you earlier about, you can see that this functional integration is basically captured by Dublin Principle 1. I have given you now the full text of the so that you can see how it is elaborated. And it says that since water sustains life, effective management of water resources demands a holistic approach, linking social and economic development with the protection of natural ecosystems. Effective management links land and water uses across the whole of a catchment area or groundwater aquifer. That's the functional one. And then if we have the societal one, this is the majority of the IWRM principles. Number 2 says that you have to involve the stakeholders in a participatory way at all levels, and it specifies that you should do this at the lowest appropriate level, where you think it is relevant. It does not mean one has to involve all stakeholders all the time at all levels, but just check what is the level of intervention and then have to make sure that key stakeholders are present. And the 3rd principle is specifically, as I said before, about women's involvement. And this principle already gives the outline how one could ensure that women are part and parcel of decision-making around water that concerns them. I have to say, however, that this principle has not been given much attention in the beginning of the IWM implementation, because it will not surprise you that the countries that started with this very often started with some form of institutional integration. And this is not surprisingly because water management is generally in the technical domain of of public administration. And then you connect, of course, amongst your groups. Now, what is the state today? As I said, this IWRM is now acknowledged. It is the United Nations agreed water governance concepts. They agreed in 1992, and they have in the 2030 agenda very clearly put integrated water resources management at the base of water governance and the other SDGs. And there is a baseline study. You can see the URL in the top, which says that basically looks at how the implementation of IWRM is worldwide. And then it says basically that 80% of countries are well underway on IWRM implementation. So how has the United Nations UN Water assessed this? They put 33 questions before the participating countries for them to fill in themselves. And they are in 4 categories: the enabling environment, which is policies, laws, and plans; the institutional frameworks, how can you make sure that you coordinate across sectors, across levels in society, and involve the stakeholders. And in this particular category, there is some gender objectives included that the country should report on. And then there's management instruments and financing. Now, we have embarked, as you undoubtedly know, on the Water Action Decade, the Water for Sustainable Development Action Decade, which was agreed in December 2016 by the member states. And it follows directly on the Water for Life Decade, 2005 to 2015, in which in this Water for Life Decade, there was a specific objective to engage women in water-related development efforts and in management. The Water Action Decade has a clear focus on IWRM. It is called the Sustainable Development and Integrated Management of Water Resources for the Achievement of Social, Environmental, and Economic Objectives. And it emphasizes stakeholder engagement, including women as the first group, but also the others. Why is this specific focus on women still necessary? I talked to you about the baseline study and the gender objectives that are included under institutional mechanisms, the second category. And if you go into this report a bit deeper, then you see that especially the gender objectives are lagging behind. Gender objectives score are generally low in countries, and quite a few countries consider gender not applicable, so it's not relevant to them to include it in their water management levels. At national level, this is 13% of countries, at the subnational level, 27%, and at transboundary level, even 44%. So despite the fact that the international community in 1992 has dedicated one of the 4 guiding principles for IWM to women, at this point, it is not yet carried out in many of the countries because it's not considered relevant. This brings me back to the underlying text of this Dublin principle. And I'm reading it out because for me, this is key, and this is what we should be doing going forward. The pivotal role of women as providers and users of water and guardians of the living environment has seldom been reflected in institutional arrangements for the development and management of water resources. It's simply not in there. Acceptance and implementation of this principle requires positive policies to address women's specific needs and to equip and empower women to participate at all levels in water resources programs, including decision-making and implementation in ways defined by them. So you have to ask the women themselves. And this is also part of the problem. Going back a little bit to gender, the fact that in principle everybody agrees, but in practice these sorts of things are very difficult to realize. That is also why I'm very happy with this project and with research increasingly addressing how can we make IWM, inclusive IWM, with women's involvement, a reality on the ground so that we can address those problems that are still unsolved when it comes to universal access to water and sanitation and water for not only domestic use, but also for economic uses. There's a last thing that I would quickly like to develop on, because if you talk about women's involvement as it is in this Dublin Principle 3, women have many roles. I mean, we have professional women, probably there's quite a few now online that you are either academic or you are water professionals. There's female ministers, there is rural women, there's gender specialists, all of this. But in this particular way, we are individual women and we do our work within the context that our peer group operates. Apart from that, women are also women civil society groups who address the interests of the groups on the ground. And this is very often quite a different voice, as I have mentioned earlier. Let me point to especially when you talk about local projects and local implementation and equality in rural areas where traditional gender norms may prevail. The World Bank has done an evaluation quite recently about rural water supply projects. And they conclude that the challenge for making decentralized rural water supply services work sustainably and reach all intended beneficiaries are typically of a social and institutional nature. So it's not a technical problem, it's a social and institutional problem. Villages with higher social capital have much better results than villages where the level of social organization is low. And greater social capital in a community leads to more participation in service design, to more effective ruling for governing and implementation, and to better monitoring of construction, use, and maintenance. Then, of course, we have to define what social capital is. It is about the value of social networks, bonding similar people and bridging between diverse people with norms of reciprocity. And this is basically a description of women's civil society. They are a large diversity of social networks that bond within a peer group, that support each other, that trust each other, and that also across sectors in society, and even from very local to international level. And this social capital that is enshrined in civil society of women is an asset for integrated water resources management, which in my view is still only marginally used to date, and which was the reason why I founded the Women for Water Partnership back in 2000-2004, to ensure that this women civil society social capital is used for better water governance and for water security for all people. And I give you one small example. There are so many, meanwhile, about a small women's group in a village high up in the Mapare Mountains near Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. And they started with 8 women and grew to a larger group. But when they started in 2006, you see the left picture, the reality. The children did not go to school full time because first they had to walk for hours to fetch the water in a faraway stream. And after the intervention, the 25,000 villagers in 4 sub-villages had their water supplies close by, clean, and managed by the community itself. And here you see a couple of pictures on how this women's group has organized community participation. In the central picture, you see even their direct involvement with the district water authorities, so that to make sure that the way the water facilities were designed meet the social situation in the villages and are truly reaching all beneficiaries. And they also managed to ensure that both men and women in all the sub-villages actively participated in the construction and in the decision where those facilities should be based, both for the piped water, which you see below, and the rainwater harvesting systems, which they constructed for the schools and the hospital, because they could not afford to pay for the water by a gallon, which was also a decision of the community, that water may be for free, but water services cost money, and this has to be paid for. So it was really a collective effort and went far beyond water provision. It went into a community service building where they have lectures, where they have electricity and computers, and where the children can do their homework. So you see, it is a holistic concept which comes out of having access to water and sanitation. Now, getting back to what I wanted to say, it's not only about gender equality. It is about making the community's activity involved in water management. And this can best be done by using the social capital which is enshrined in women's civil society. And I thank you for your attention.